Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third annual Sheffrin Lecture in Public Policy. I'm Ron Mangan. I'm the Dean of Social Sciences and the College of Letters and Sciences, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. My predecessor, Steve Sheffrin, and his wife, Anjali Sheffrin, established the Sheffrin Lecture in Public Policy with a generous gift to the college in 2008, the year that Steve stepped down as Dean of Social Sciences. Dean Sheffrin held this position with great distinction for a decade before leaving us to direct the Murphy Institute at Tulane University. The Sheffrins made the decision to endow a lecture series in public policy for several reasons. First, the series ties in with the natural strengths of the division and to the disciplines in the social sciences broadly. Second, it reflects the Sheffrins' own long-standing interest in public policy. Steve is an internationally known macroeconomist and an expert in tax policy. And Anjali, who received her PhD in economics from UC Davis in 1981, served in the utility and energy sector for more than 25 years. Finally, the Sheffrins wanted to give a gift that would benefit the entire division, not just an individual department or program within the social sciences. And this is very much in keeping with Steve's commitment to excellence for every department and program in the Division of Social Sciences. The Sheffrins very much wanted to be here on this occasion, as they typically are, but tonight's event coincides with the graduation ceremonies at Tulane, for which Steve has an important role. But I want to ask that we give a short round of applause just to acknowledge their gift in establishing this. Now, just a quick thing about the lecture series. It supports an annual lecture on topics related to social sciences public policy that have broad relevance to our students, faculty, and to the wider community. Lecturers can be academics with specific research interests in policy-related issues, or prominent practitioners whose independent research or professional expertise make them uniquely qualified to speak in this series. This flexibility enables us to host lectures on a wide range of topics. Our inaugural speaker was MIT economics professor Jonathan Gruber, who lectured on the Obama health care plan, which had just been signed into law. Last year, Peter Gallison, a professor of physics and the history of science at Harvard University, talked about government secrecy, both contemporary and historical. Tonight, of course, we'll hear from Princeton University professor of sociology, Doug Massey, on the unexpected impact of government regulation on immigration and migration to the United States. Before we move on to Professor Massey's lecture, I'd like to point out that we have here today the updated Sheffrin Lecture plaque, which hangs on the wall just outside my office, and that's because I'm the dean and I got to say where it got to be hung. And it is a perpetual plaque, and we have Doug Massey, 2012, so you are immortalized, as you said to me earlier. Now, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank generous co-sponsors of tonight's event. Our co-sponsors include the Herbert A. Young Society, the UC Global Health Initiative, the Department of Sociology, the Institute for Governmental Affairs, the School of Law, the Levine Family Fund in Economics, and Economy, Justice, and Society. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Kim Schauman of the Department of Sociology, who will do the honors to introduce Professor Massey. Kim.
Thank you. I'm pleased to welcome you all, and I'm very delighted to introduce Doug Massey. Doug is the Henry G. Bryant Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He returned to Princeton, which is where he completed his doctoral work, in 2003 after he spent most of his career at the University of Pennsylvania. That affiliation was interrupted by only the 6 years that he spent on the faculties of the Department of Sociology and the Harris School of Public Policy Studies at the University of Chicago. Doug's list of scholarly and professional accomplishments is truly impressive. He has authored over 200 articles and book chapters, and authored or edited 18 books, and has 3 more books currently under review or in preparation. He is currently the editor or serves on the editorial board of 9 scholarly journals, and he is the current or past president of 3 national professional associations. I could go on, but suffice it to say that Doug has been a formative and agenda-setting leader in sociology specifically and in the social sciences more generally. His seminal work on residential segregation illuminates the extent of racial segregation and its multiple dimensions and the many ways that segregation maintains both racial and economic inequality in the United States. Doug's studies of racial inequality in post-secondary education were the first to document the different characteristics that students bring to campus and to trace out the influence of those differences on later educational outcomes. His many analyses of international migration, primarily between Latin America and the US, have revealed the social mechanisms that promote and sustain immigration flows, and they have given him a uniquely informed perspective on US immigration policy. He will share that perspective with us this evening as he discusses the paradoxical origins and radical consequences of America's war on immigrants. Doug's work is always dogmatically empirical, and it never fails to be engaging and accessible to both seasoned academics as well as undergraduate students, even those that are not destined to go on to graduate school. His work figures prominently in policy debates, and his tireless engagement in those debates represents the best of public sociology, public scholarship today. Before welcoming Doug, I want to point out that there will be time after his presentation for questions and answers. If you would like to ask a question, please use the microphone that's set up right there in the middle of the aisle so that your question will be included on the video feed. And now, please join me in welcoming Doug Massey.
It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here delivering the third Sheffrin Lecture on a topic that is near and dear to my heart and over the years has lost none of its interest to the public. The first thing one has to understand about immigration policy is that it's made by politicians. And as politicians, their behavior is governed mostly by what they see as the impact on the next election cycle. And when it comes to immigration, they don't sit down and look at immigration and say, I've got to understand immigration, how it works, what the logic of immigration is, what are the mechanisms that govern it. And then when I've understood that, figure out how we want to manage this for the public good. They think about immigration when it becomes a political problem, and they act when it becomes a political problem. And since immigration is so wound up in America's national myth and national narrative, immigration is a particularly salient feature of American policy. And it reflects both the loftiest aspirations and ideals of America and some of its saddest and most retrograde emotions. That's the story I want to tell tonight. And it begins with our lofty aspirations. And what I put up here is a bunch of squiggly lines, as you can see. And what this is it's not working. Oops. There we go. It's badly positioned. Okay, I think I got it. Okay, what we have here are flows of Mexican immigrants into the United States for 110 years, from 1900 to 2010, in three statuses: legal status, documented, illegal status, undocumented, and temporary but legal workers. I measure documented migration as the number of entries for permanent legal residence. I measure temporary migration as the number of people entering on temporary work visas. And undocumented migration I'm measuring as using apprehensions, but apprehensions by themselves are a very poor measure of the flow of immigrants because it depends on the enforcement effort. If you have more people looking for immigrants, they're going to catch more immigrants. So it's apprehensions divided by the number of Border Patrol officers. It's kind of standardized for the enforcement effort. And when you do that, it becomes a reasonably serviceable measure of the flow of undocumented migrants. And what you see here is that immigration from Mexico goes way back into the early 20th century. The first boom period was in the 1920s, and it begins around 1909, 1907, when the U.S. and Japan reached the gentleman's agreement with Japan to cut off the flow of Japanese labor into the United States, and immediately employers began turning to Mexico and start recruitment. The laser pointer is right in between the two direction pointers, and my thumb is big. And so you see that immigration starts, and this is small, and then the U.S. enters the First World War. We start our own temporary worker program, and then in the 1920s, there's actually a boom in Mexican immigration. This is the first boom in Mexican immigration in the United States. Historians call it the flood tide of Mexican immigration. The U.S. had imposed national origin quotas against Southern and Eastern Europeans, had banned Asians, had banned Africans, and in the 1920s, American economy was booming and they needed labor. So they began recruiting black migrants from the South, and they began recruiting Mexicans into the United States, and that was the first big boom period. And that gave rise, that was the foundation of Mexican neighborhoods all over the United States, including the two contemporary largest Mexican settlements, which are Los Angeles and Chicago. It's not that Los Angeles was a Mexican city that stayed a Mexican city from the time of 1848 when we annexed it to the present. Los Angeles became an overwhelmingly Anglo-American city, and then in the 1920s, mass migration transformed it and created what we now know as the barrio of East LA. At the same time, Chicago was cut off from its sources of labor in Eastern and Southern Europe and began to recruit Mexicans, and they established the first Mexican barrios in Chicago, the first Mexican neighborhoods in Chicago in the 1920s as well. All this comes to a grinding halt in 1929. The stock market crashes, the Depression hits, and the U.S. launches the first mass deportation campaign in its history. Mexicans were specifically targeted. They were rounded up in cities all over the western and midwestern United States. Mexican neighborhoods are cordoned off. Police swept through, rounded up anybody that looked Mexican. If they couldn't prove they had the right to be there, be present at that moment, they were taken to railroad yards, loaded on boxcars, and shipped to the border where they were summarily deported across, including many, many American citizens, children born in the United States. And remember that at this point in time, there was no exclusions on Mexicans, and so most of these people were here legally. But they were deported outside of due process, outside of judicial processes. And this killed the first period of Mexican immigration in the United States, and during the Great Depression, there was virtually no movement back and forth. Then the United States enters the Second World War in 1941, and in 1942 goes back to Mexico and says, gee, we're real sorry about that deportation campaign 10 years ago. We could sure use your labor again. How about you join with us in a binational treaty to set up a temporary worker program? And this became the Bracero program. And you can see the Bracero program starts small, and it peaks in 1944-45 at about 50,000 workers. Not big. And then afterwards, Congress tries to ratchet it down because the war's over, right? But after the war, we enter the post-war economic boom. And all those Okies that had been flowing into the Central Valley of California to take the jobs in the 1930s were now working in high-paid union jobs in defense factories all over California. And so they didn't return. And so there was tremendous labor shortages in the agricultural sector particularly, and Congress did not respond by increasing the number of guest worker slots. So growers took it in their own hands, and they began telling their few braceros that when you go back at the end of the season, tell your brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, friends, and relatives that when you come back next year, they should join you and they'll find a job here. And so this is the beginning of illegal migration to the United States, the first big period of illegal migration in the United States. The border was not even defended until 1924. In 1924, the Border Patrol was founded, and for the first time, it was defended with a total of 300 Border Patrol officers for 2,000 miles. So this whole time, there's virtually no illegal migration. Then, when the war ends and demand surges, growers begin recruiting. Congress belatedly responds. They increase They increase the number of guest worker visas here, and that brings a temporary respite. But then they try to ratchet it back down, and it goes back up. And so Congress responds again belatedly, and it has another respite, but then it surges again. And this is an artificially inflated surge, which comes to a head in 1953, 1954, when the Korean War ends. The U.S. enters a small post-war recession. It's the McCarthy era in the United States. A lot of anti-foreign hysteria and xenophobia. McCarthy is portraying Latin America as a hotbed of communist activity, and the border is the soft underbelly of the United States. And Democrats, for the first time in 2 decades, leave the White House, and Eisenhower takes over, and he appoints as head of the Immigration and Naturalization Service a former Marine Corps commandant, who immediately launches Operation Wetback in response to agitation against all these illegal migrants that could possibly be providing communist influence in the United States. And that's the surge here we see. It's the first mass militarization of the Mexico-US border. First time in American history that there's 1 million deportations of arrests, apprehensions at the border, 1 million apprehensions and deportations from the border area. And if you listen to Lou Dobbs now, he will tell you that this is what we need. We need another Operation Wetback, because we got tough with those migrants, we kicked them out of the country, and we restored control of the border. But that's not what really happened, because you'll notice at the same time that they launched Operation Wetback, Congress very quietly more than doubled the size of the guest worker program. And so in the late 1950s, illegal migration virtually disappears once again. We have 450,000 guest workers coming into the United States per year. And the number of legal permanent residents entering the United States is about 50,000 per year, fluctuating, but averaging around 50,000 per year. So about 500,000 Mexicans are coming into the United States every year. 450,000 are circulating back and forth, 50,000 are settling. And that becomes the status quo. And in the late 1950s and 1950s, we have this relative peace on the border, and a regular regime is established. Now here's where we come to immigration policy and the lofty motives part of our story. The 1960s were, of course, the civil rights movement. And in the mid-1960s, the civil rights movement gains momentum under Lyndon Johnson, and landmark pieces of civil rights legislation are passed. The 1964 Civil Rights Bill, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Fair Housing Act, landmark pieces of legislation. And in this context, the old restrictive national origin quotas that explicitly discriminated against Southern and Eastern Europeans, read Polish Catholics and Russian Jews, came to be seen as intolerably racist. And the bans on Asian immigration and the bans on African immigration also came to be seen as intolerably racist. And so this resulted in the 1965 amendments to the Immigration and Nationality Act, which at the time was not really seen as a piece of immigration legislation. It was seen as a piece of civil rights legislation to bring our immigration code into conformity with the broader deracialization of policy in the United States. It indeed opened the door to African immigration and to Asian immigration, and many people think it opened the door to Latin American immigration, but it had precisely the opposite effect. The law was passed and was discussed. Virtually no thought was given to the fact that we had an ongoing migratory system that by 1965 was well institutionalized and well established, of 500,000 people per year. And the amendments, the 1965 amendments, indeed established the first ever numerical limitation on immigration from Latin America, established a hemispheric quota of 120,000 people per year from the Western Hemisphere. And this took effect in 1968, and in 1976, new amendments were introduced to put it under the national quota system. So each country had a fixed quota, which worked out to roughly 20,000 plus or minus visas per year per country. And before this fact, Mexico had never been limited numerically. So the 65 Act actually imposed numerical limitations where there had been none before. The other thing that happened in 1965 was Congress, in the heat of the civil rights movement, decided that the Bracero program was in fact an exploitative labor program, which of course it was. And on the level with sharecropping regimes in the American South. And they unilaterally terminated, against protests, vociferous protests from Mexico, the Bracero program. So from 1965, you go from a regime where you have 500,000 Mexicans entering per year, and had been doing so for some time, and all these connections have been established between migrants and employers, migration chains have been established, and 450,000 workers were circulating, 50,000 were settling. Fast forward 2 decades to the end of the 1970s, Mexico has a quota of 20,000, roughly 20,000 visas and no guest worker program. What happens? Well, labor demand didn't change, dependence of growers on workers didn't change, and that is the resumption of undocumented migration. And you can see that undocumented migration rises steadily, but peaks in the late 1970s, then fluctuates up and down in response to rhythms on both sides of the economy, both sides of the border, economic conditions, falls down, and then starting in the late 1990s and 2000 actually trails off. So basically undocumented migration peaks in the late 1970s, basically reestablishing the flow that had existed before under legal auspices. And legal immigration begins a slow but steady climb as more and more people become legal residents and get sponsored, and eventually many become citizens. And as they become citizens, they sponsor the entry of their relatives without limitation. So basically, this is extremely important to understanding the current dynamics of immigration to the United States. The rise of illegal migration. The rise of illegal migration in the United States provided an opportunity for ambitious politicians and entrepreneurial bureaucrats to frame Mexican immigration as a dangerous development for the United States. Because people who are migrating illegally, by definition, are criminals, lawbreakers. And it brought about a framing of Mexican immigration as a threat to the United States. And that is, that threat and that framing of the threat created a dynamic that drove the United States to ever more restrictive policies that had ever more negative consequences, counterproductive consequences for the immigration system. This is simply a snapshot of the period from 55 to 95. You see this increase. So you basically reestablish the Bracero flows under undocumented auspices, and once you hit the late 1970s, it stops. And corresponding to the rise of illegal migration, you see the rise of what Leo Chavez, anthropologist at University of California, Irvine, has called the Latino threat narrative. He quoted up magazine covers of Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News World Report from 65 to 2000, and he saw a rising frequency of negative alarmist magazine covers, growing from 18% to 37% to 45% in the 1990s. So a steady increase in alarmism. Immigration is increasingly portrayed in an alarmist fashion. There are two metaphors that get used. Initially, it was a marine metaphor. Illegal migration is a flood that's going to inundate the United States and flood American culture, drown us. But increasingly over time, that gave way to a martial metaphor, where it was an alien invasion, whereby outgunned Border Patrol officers were repelling bonsai charges at the border, and the invasion was going to destroy the American way of life, and illegal immigrants were a time bomb that were ticking to destroy American culture. All these things were deployed in large numbers in newspapers, magazines, and the media. What I did here was look at mentions of immigration as a crisis, flood, or invasion paired with Mexico or Mexicans, and just did a frequency count. And you can see that starting in 1965, when the Bracero program was shut down and the beginnings of numerical limitation occurred, there's a steady increase in the reference of Mexicans as floods or invasions and crises, which peaks about the time illegal migration peaks in 1979. Then it fluctuates, and these correspond mainly to ups and downs in the American economy, and then trails off. But each peak is associated with another piece of anti-immigrant legislation or policy that's implemented. And it sets off this self-reinforcing cycle. This is the correspondence between apprehensions and threatening metaphors. So you can see that they are associated in time. And what this does is trigger a conservative reaction in the United States. An underappreciated element of the American turn towards conservatism in recent years has been the rise of illegal migration. As more and more alien invaders are here, as Americans feel more and more threatened by illegal migrants, they become more conservative, more xenophobic, more inward-looking. And this is just a cross-time association, you see. And basically what happens is we end up with this feedback cycle. So we're triggered by the imposition of new restrictions. And undocumented entries are occurring and apprehensions go up. Entries are rising because there's no legal opportunities after 1965. Apprehensions increase. That produces an anti-immigrant reaction, which triggers restrictive legislation, restrictive operations, increases the number of Border Patrol agents, increases the size of the Border Patrol, and more hours spent patrolling the border, which produces more apprehensions. And then what happens is that even though this peaks in the late 1970s, apprehensions continue to rise, driven by this feedback cycle. And it becomes self-sustaining apart from anything to do with the Mexico-US border. So the rise of illegal migration brings us to the less lofty parts of American immigration policy. Once immigration is framed as an alien invasion of threatening lawbreakers, it gets used by politicians for political purposes, to mobilize voters, to create an issue, to win elections, used by bureaucratic entrepreneurs to gain resources. In 1976, the head of the INS publishes an article in Reader's Digest entitled "Illegal Immigrants, Time to Call a Halt," alleging that immigrants were coming into the United States in massive numbers and at that point numbered 20 million in the United States. And so this is the relationship between number of apprehensions and the percent conservatives. So it rises and then kind of reaches an asymptote. And that's not particularly convincing evidence, so I turned to the General Social Survey, which is a survey of the United States, U.S. population in different, and we pool across different years, it's done every year or so, and we look at controlling for all this stuff what the effect of apprehensions is on the likelihood of somebody self-identifying as conservative, and you can see it's the biggest single effect in the model, and that's controlling for the U.S. economic context and the earnings that people could expect, which is employment rates times median wages. So apprehensions has a big effect on percent conservative. We'd ideally like to see how apprehensions affect support for exclusionist policies. Unfortunately, that question wasn't asked every year, but it was asked in 1996 and 2004, and so we can kind of indirectly look by looking at the effect of conservative identification on support for exclusionist policies, and as you can see, the more people self-identify as conservative, the more they support restrictionist policies. So what this does is produce a very powerful feedback system. very powerful feedback system, where you have entries that's sparked by the rise in undocumented entries, which was real, but peaks by 1979. But the apprehensions set off a feedback cycle where more apprehensions produce more conservatives, which produces more restrictive legislation and restrictive border operations, which produces more Border Patrol agents, Border Patrol budget, line watch hours, and you generate more apprehensions. And the main pathways illustrated in red running through this top loop: conservative, restrictive legislation, Border Patrol agents, line watch hours, apprehensions. And so this just keeps circulating, driving up apprehensions even though entries is fixed. And it's a very powerful effect in causal terms. This is the effect of apprehensions, raw apprehensions from basically here to here to there. And this is the effect through the feedback loop. So it was sufficient to keep driving forward apprehensions and making people feel that they were being invaded, even though the number of illegal migrants the flow of illegal migrants had actually peaked. And this is a scatter plot showing the effect of percent conservative on the cumulative restrictive legislation from 1960, should be 65 to 2009. And this is the effect of the cumulative legislation on line watch hours. And this is the restrictive legislation I'm talking about. I know you can't read it, but there's a lot of it. And if you can read the dates, you see that it starts in 65, and the next big law is not until 76, but then it starts increasing in frequency. And then it starts, rapidly increasing the number of pieces of legislation that are intended to restrict or inhibit immigration. And you see the increase, the cumulative number of anti-immigrant restrictive laws. And so you end up with this paradox that the solid line is the actual estimate, our estimate of the underlying flow of illegal migrants, whereas the dotted line is the number of apprehensions. So apprehension just keeps on rising, and in 1986 results in the passage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which legalized 3 million former undocumented migrants and for a time dropped the flow. But then the flow resumed and continued on. But this IRCA in 1986 began a long process of border militarization, which continued to fuel the cycle and had a variety of unintended and entirely counterproductive processes. This just gives you an idea of what I'm talking about when I use the word war on immigrants. This is the intensity of border enforcement as measured by number of Border Patrol officers, line watch hours, and Border Patrol budget, divided by the value in 1986. 1986 is 1. By 2010, Border Patrol's budget was 23 times its level in 1986. The number of line watch hours was 8 times, and the number of Border Patrol officers was about 6 times. And remember that illegal migration peaks right about here. And so this is all going on despite the fact that there's no secular increase in illegal migration. So this dynamic was well established in the period between 65 and 95. Beginning after 1995, we start getting the war on terror, which has a kind of an exogenous effect on our immigration system. In 1993 and 1995, we had the bombing of the World Trade Center, the first bombing, and then the Oklahoma City bombing, and that resulted in the passage of the 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, a charming title for a piece of legislation, which was harshly anti-immigrant. It declared any immigrant who'd ever committed a crime to be deportable, and they rendered it ex post facto. So if you had entered as a baby from Indochina and you got into a gang, you got in trouble, and then in 1987 you did some time in jail, and then you straightened your life out and you went to become a citizen in 1997, they would look up your criminal record and they'd find that you had this criminal infraction. Instead of making you a citizen, they would deport you. And it limited rights to appeal, limited rights to due process. It was a very harsh act. And then that, of course, didn't bring an end to terrorism. We had the 1998 bombing of the USS Cole, the 2000 bombing of the embassies, and of course the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York, which prompted the passage of the USA Patriot Act, which basically became known as the War on Terror, which I argue really became a war on immigrants. And what it really produced was an array of restrictive border operations and restrictive enforcement operations which had not existed before. So since Operation Wetback in 1953-54, there had been no named enforcement operation. Then in 1993, in El Paso, the Border Patrol launches Operation Gatekeeper, Blockade, 94 Operation Gatekeeper, and then as you can see, looking at the years, they just keep proliferating and accelerating. And I love the names they pick. Operation Stone Garden. Stone Garden was an operation in the Second World War against the Nazis. Operation Return to Sender. Operation Rapid Repat. Operation Scheduled Departure. They really have a way for names, in Homeland Security. And this is where you see the restrictive operations. There's virtually none. And then in the 1996 legislation passes, it jumps, and then after 2001 Patriot Act, just no end to it. But this doesn't have a big effect on conservative opinion. There's no real strong relationship. What it does is accelerate deportations of Mexicans. So this is the scatter plot showing the relationship between restrictive legislation operations and deportations, and you can see that that's a fairly strong relationship. And so it creates this new dynamic that comes into play in the later part of the period, where the terrorist attacks very powerfully produce restrictive operations, which very powerfully increase the INS budget, which produces deportations, which feed back on a conservative reaction. But basically, the thing is driving deportations forward. And here's what I'm talking about. So for decades, deportations from the United States were in the tens of thousands with no real trend. 1996 legislation passes, boom, it goes up to nearly 200,000 a year. The 2001 legislation passes, boom, it goes up to about 400,000 a year. At the height of the deportation campaigns against Mexicans in the 1930s, 125,000 people were being deported from the United States each year. We have now built a bureaucracy that will permanently, ad infinitum, deport 400,000 people every year, no matter what. That's what they do. As a result, the average number of people in detention has dramatically increased. The fastest growing component of the U.S. criminal justice complex is now immigration detention system, and half of the immigration prisons are private. And the Corrections Corporation of America is a big promoter of anti-immigrant legislation and propaganda around the states. They contributed to the authoring of SB 1070 in Arizona, and then took out ads in newspapers to facilitate its passage, and have benefited by the increased incarceration, and a lot of the business goes to the Correction Corporations of America, whose major stockholders are the Cheney family. Oops. We've got this absurd situation now where a bunch of terrorists fly planes into the towers on 9/11, and to show Al-Qaeda how tough we are, we deport our Mexicans. So these are total deportations from the United States in 2009. You see, Mexicans are the lion's share, followed by Guatemala, Honduras, Salvador, and then Brazil. The actual terrorist origins were the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, 17 and 3. Other terrorist regimes are equally small, terrorist countries. Basically, 96% of the people we're deporting are Latin Americans. And last time I checked, there were no Al-Qaeda cells in Latin America. So this is what's happened. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and then the terrorism, the war on terror, jumped in and amped it up. It was like immigration enforcement on steroids. What were the consequences of all this? With massive increase in enforcement. Well, this is the probability of taking an undocumented trip to the United States, a first trip or a later trip. And you can see that after 1965 it increased, but by the late 1970s, in keeping with the official statistics, it stabilized, fluctuates, and then around just after 2000 it starts to fall. And this is repeat trips. That falls dramatically as the Bracero program was in effect, but then stabilizes, goes up a bit, and falls down. So the massive increase in enforcement really has no real effect on the volume of entry into the United States. And we can actually confirm this with a regression model. These are all the variables and all the controls we have in place, but these are the policy context, which is what we're interested in. And what you see here is that the first trips to the United States basically are predicted by two big things. The availability of legal visas. More legal visas that are accessible, less likely you are to migrate as undocumented. Pretty simple. And border enforcement actually has the opposite effect. As you increase border enforcement, people who were thinking about migration think they better get in before it gets really bad. And so it actually boosted the probability of migration to the United States. The big effect it had was to reduce return migration. Once migrants were in the United States, once they'd paid the costs and experienced the risks of undocumented border crossing, they were reluctant to do it again, and so they stayed put. So in 1986, IRCA is passed, and you can see there's a very stable pattern of return migration. People, experienced migrants had an 80% chance of returning within 12 months of entry, and first trippers had about a 60% chance of returning within 12 months of entry. You start militarizing the border, it starts to drift down, and then you start putting all those border blockades and really militarizing, and it just plummets towards zero. And you can see the effect of the border militarization was to dramatically increase the cost of border crossing. In real terms, it was about $500 a pop. Before 1986, it began to rise and then escalated exponentially to where now it's about $3,000 a crossing. And I mean, just a simple neoclassical economic model will tell you that if people are migrating and they're subtracting the projected benefits from the projected costs, if you increase the costs to make the trip profitable, they have to stay longer. So if a migrant earned $500 a month, under the old regime, they would work 1 month and they'd be in the black. But now, under the new regime, for $3,000, they have to work 6 months. So that's going to increase the length of trips, which is another way of saying it's going to decrease the rate of return migration. And it also increased death rate along the border. As we all know, it basically tripled the relative number of deaths along the border. And you can see that the effect of enforcement was to reduce the likelihood of return, especially from a first trip. The other thing it did was dramatically change the geography of border crossing. Prior to 1993-94, 85% of the crossings occurred here and here. After 1993-94, you harden these places, you put up walls, you set up footfall detectors, you put in infrared sensors, you have helicopters flying over, now you've got drones flying over. It erected 3 steel walls in Seriatim, running from the Pacific Ocean to the Sierra Madre Mountains, and you station a Chevy Blazer with 2 Border Patrol officers staring at that wall every 100 yards, and guess what? People initially ran into here and got caught in large numbers, and then they wised up, and then they started going through the Sonoran Desert in through Arizona. Prior to 93-94, virtually no one crossed in Arizona. After 1993-94, it became the prime border crossing. Prior to 93-94, Arizona was not an important receiving state. After 93-94, it became an immigrant receiving state because the diversion of migrants away from California occurred just as the Phoenix residential construction boom was happening, and a lot of Mexicans settled there. So a major consequence was a dramatic reordering of the geography of border crossing. So this shows the Mexican state of border crossing. And you can see that Baja California just was kept increasing. This is from the Mexican Migration Project data. And then you launch the border militarizations, and it begins to fall, and then it plummets after Operation Gatekeeper, and goes down to very low levels. Goes from about 70% of crossings down to about 25 25% of crossings. And what changes? Sonora, which is going into Arizona. And then, of course, you start clamping down in Arizona, and that falls, and then other crossing points emerge. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. You know, you whack the mole here, he pops up there. And this also produced, once you diverted the migrants away from California, permanently, it turns out, they go other places. So it changed the geography of destinations as well. According to census data, before the border crackdowns in 1993-94, 2/3 of all Mexican immigrants went to California. Afterwards, 1/3 went to California. And that's been permanent since then. So where do these 1/3 go? Everywhere in the United States. And you can see this in a dramatic decline in the number of Mexicans going to the 3 primary states of destination: California, Texas, or Illinois. And if you interview migrants and you say, what state do you migrate to? They go, California, Texas, y Chicago. Illinois, it's basically just Chicago. And the number going to other states dramatically increases. So now we've got Mexicans going to states that have never before experienced immigration, or much less Mexican immigration. And this has triggered this state-level reaction with the proliferation of anti-immigrant state legislation, which wasn't even counted until 2005 because there were no bills introduced, and then it's proliferated since then. It's also led to the expansion of these 287G agreements, big hotbed here in Arizona, where local authorities sign contracts with the federal authorities to assist in immigration enforcement. Anti-Hispanic hate crimes have gone up dramatically. They've been falling for many years, and then after 2002 they began to rise. Public opinion has turned against immigrants. This is from a 2006 Pew survey. I wish they'd do a new one. I'd like to know what it is now, but that's the most recent data. Half of all Americans believe that immigrants threaten American values. 54% say Americans need to be protected against foreign influence, and 60% approved of the activities of the Minutemen. And this is what you end up with. This is Maricopa County, Phoenix, Arizona, and you have ritual displays of incarcerated migrants from Joe Arpaio's immigration detention system, dressed in pink t-shirts and shackles with striped pants to humiliate them. And that humiliation was not enough, so he switched to pink shorts and pink handcuffs and paraded them through town while he's doing the voiceover. This is not about immigration enforcement. This is ritual humiliation for political purposes. It has more in common with Kristallnacht than with anything to do with our immigration laws. And Joe Arpaio, although he's increasingly under challenge from federal authorities for civil rights violations, and I believe deservedly so, still is one of the most popular politicians in Arizona. Well, Congress, in its zeal to punish foreigners, also began to strip away rights not only from undocumented migrants, but from legal immigrants. Now it is the case that any non-citizen, whether legal status or not, has virtually no rights in this country, is a very serious threat of deportation at any moment. Any low-level member of any law enforcement agency or the Department of Homeland Security can unilaterally throw somebody in the immigration detention system, and they have no right to a phone call, they have no right to a hearing, they have no right to a lawyer, they have no right to an open court hearing. They can be deported in secret without anybody knowing. And so it scared the bejesus out of immigrants. And guess what? When you start punishing non-citizens, they defend themselves by becoming citizens. And Mexicans historically had one of the lowest rates of naturalization of any immigrant group in the country. And after IRCA was enacted, and especially after the 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act was enacted, the cumulative number of naturalized citizens zoomed up to about 2.5 million. So there's 2.5 million citizens who probably wouldn't have become citizens in the absence of structural changes. It was also facilitated by Mexico, which is a lot more attuned to the binational realities than we are, that authorized binational citizenship about the same time. And what this means is that every time you create a citizen, you create entitlements for legal entry. So Congress beats on non-citizens. The poor people defend themselves by becoming citizens, and then they acquire the right to sponsor even more immigrants through the legal family reunification system. So prior to 1996, about a quarter of all entries from Mexico were citizen relatives. Now 3/4 of all people from Mexico entering are citizen relatives. And the average number of legal immigrants entering Mexico from the entering the United States from Mexico per year in the last 5 years is 160,000. So if Congress wanted to stop immigration, it backfired. We've got a situation where we've had this unprecedented increase in the number of Mexicans in the United States. We're at about 12 or 11 million now. But a large share of them, an unprecedentedly large share of them, are out of status or illegal. Never before have we had an immigrant group in the United States with such a large percentage of the people who are undocumented. So it's not a small segment of the population. Among all Mexican immigrants present in the United States, at least 60% are illegal and have no rights whatsoever. So we're at a funny point, an unusual point, a unique point in American history. We have ongoing legal documented immigration running at between 150 and 200,000 per year because we've scared enough people to become citizens and they're able to then sponsor their relatives. Meanwhile, illegal migration is falling, and it plummeted especially in recent years after the recession. And sources on both sides of the border. My data from the Mexican Migration Project, estimates from the Pew Hispanic Survey, estimates from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, as well as Mexican sources, the AMIF data from the Colegio de la Frontera Norte, the Mexico's basic demographic surveys, the CONAPO estimates, the INEGI estimates from Mexico, all show that illegal migration in the United States has reached a net of zero. In 2008, it actually went negative from 2008 to 2009, and since 2009, it's been more or less zero. So illegal migration has finally, after 60 years, stopped. Legal migration, however, legal permanent migration is actually at pretty high levels, averaging about 160,000 per year in recent years, but sometimes going above 200,000 per year. Meanwhile, without anybody noticing, under the radar, the number of temporary worker entries has skyrocketed. So that in 2010, the most recent year we have data, there were 517,000 temporary worker entries from Mexico. Without anybody noticing, we've instituted a guest worker program. And this doesn't count 800,000 business visa entries or 50,000 exchange visitor entries. So it's kind of back to the future. In late 50s, we had about 500,000 people per year coming in. It was a small number of documented migrants, mostly guest workers, and illegal migration was declining, was low and declining. At present, we have about 500,000 people entering per year, but mostly they're in documented statuses, guest workers and permanent legal residents, and the apprehension rate is also small and falling. The main difference between then and now is that in 1956-57 we didn't have a resident undocumented population. In 2000, at present, and actually I can extend this to 2010, we currently have around 11 million undocumented migrants, about 60% of whom are Mexican, and about, actually this is higher according to the latest estimates, about 60% are also, of Mexicans present are also undocumented. Of the 11 million, about 3+ million entered as children, and 500 to 1,000 to 1 million were former Central Americans who were here legally for up to a decade in temporary protected status, and then had that status revoked and suddenly became illegal. So if you follow what I've said so far, it's that Congress made a variety of changes to immigration law for political reasons. in 1965, there were very laudable reasons to deracialize American civil rights policy, the American immigration policy. But they did it in a way that took no account of the on-the-ground realities of an existing, well-established, institutionalized flow, and by imposing limits on immigration from Mexico in particular, from the Western Hemisphere in general, generated a flow of illegal migrants. The rise of illegal migration then provided the opportunity for political entrepreneurs and bureaucratic entrepreneurs to mobilize on much less laudable grounds. First, employing illegal migration as part of the stagecraft of the Cold War. So Ronald Reagan starts talking about how Sandinistas are going to be coming in. And I suggest, if you want to get a sense of the zeitgeist of this time, go to your video store and rent Red Dawn, which is all about how we are invaded by Spanish-speaking troops commanded by Russian officers that take over and occupy the United States. And it's Patrick Swayze's big screen debut, where he, the whole part of the story is the wrestling team beats it out of town as the Russians are landing, and the Cubans and the Latin Americans and the Sandinistas, and they stop at the guns and ammo store on the way out of town, and they go up into the mountains, and they perpetuate a guerrilla insurgency against these dastardly people. And then when the War on Terror happens, suddenly Mexico-U.S. border becomes an important point of theater for the War on Terror. So I'm testifying before Congress, and a theoretically liberal Democratic senator named Chuck Schumer from New York gets up and says, the Mexico-U.S. border is the front line in the War on Terror. Now put yourself in Al-Qaeda's shoes. You want to launch a terrorist attack on the United States. Where are you going to go? You're going to go to Tijuana? Set up a terrorist cell in Tijuana where you stick out like a sore thumb and the narcos will probably kill you? And if you decide to launch your attack against the United States, you face the most militarized border anywhere except the Korean DMZ. There are no Islamic populations in Mexico, so you can't blend in. And there are there's no terrorist infrastructure in Mexico. Where do you go? Logically, you go to Canada. Large Islamic populations in Toronto, places like that. A relatively undefended border. Known terrorist cells and a terrorist infrastructure in place. In fact, we've had the Millennium Bomber attempted to enter from Canada. But the Mexico-U.S. border is the front line in the War on Terror. So it's the politicization of migration. Suddenly Mexico is involved in the War on Terror. And we end up deporting Mexicans and militarizing the border with our neighbor and one of our closest trading partners, which makes absolutely no sense. But what I tell people is we're closer to comprehensive immigration reform than you might think. Historically, people have talked about 4 pillars of immigration reform. First, always first, get control of the border. Well, for 4 years now, we've been net zero. The border is under control. The number of apprehensions along the border has fallen precipitously and is now at the lowest point since 1972. We got control of the border. 2, a guest worker program. Quietly, without anybody noticing, we've amped up entries in a variety of guest worker categories, not just H visas, but a variety of other visa categories, to the point where we have 517,000 entries per year, which exceeds the number during the Bracero period. Check that one off. We've got a guest worker program. Increase the size of the quotas for our close trading partners in NAFTA, and particularly Mexico. Mexico should not get a 20,000 per year quota. Mexico is a country of 105 million people, a $1 trillion economy, locked into a free trade agreement with the United States, and it gets the same number of limited visas as Botswana. But Mexicans have taken it in their own hands. Congress scared the bejesus out of them. They became citizens, and they've manufactured an increase in the quotas to the tune of 160,000 per year. Check. What's left? Legalization. A path to legalization for those who are here. And we saw that between 2008 and 2009, there was a drop of about 1 million people in the undocumented population, but those who remain are the ones who are rooted here. They've been here for a decade or more. They have families, they have kids, they have US-born kids, they have jobs, they have houses, they have mortgages. And overwhelmingly, they've stayed out of criminal trouble. And their violations of law are mainly civil. And as a way forward, what I have proposed to Congress and what I've proposed to many people is that for political reasons, we divide the population into two. For those who entered it as minors, as children, and who have no criminal record, give them an unconditional amnesty. They didn't do anything. They didn't make the decision to come here. We don't punish children for the actions of their parents. And these people have grown up here, they speak English, they've graduated from high school, many have, against the odds, attended college and junior college or graduated from college. And yet they have nowhere to go in this, the only society that they know and the only society they've grown up in. To give you an idea of the absurdities that we have now, 4 years ago, the salutatorian graduate of Princeton was outed as an undocumented migrant from the Dominican Republic. Came here when he was 3 years old, grew up in the streets of New York. His mother got him into the Catholic schools. Turned out he had a fabulous aptitude for classical Greek and Latin. He is the top classics graduate in 3 decades in Princeton. And when he gave the salutatorian address to the Princeton graduating class in Latin, he became so prominent that everybody discovered he was an illegal migrant. And he was forced to leave the United States. He was forced to take a full scholarship to Oxford University. So, you know, we drive out somebody we have paid to educate from K through 12. And we've educated him, we've paid for his health, we've paid for his schooling. And just when he's entering his productive years, and he's going to be very productive, we get rid of him and lose our investment. It makes no sense whatsoever. So immediate and unconditional amnesty for those who entered as minors and have no criminal record. For those who became undocumented as adults, I advocate a pathway to legal status, whereby you set aside a number of criteria that you want people to adhere to: learn some English, take a civics course, pay taxes, have American-born kids, be a homeowner, whatever pro-social behavior you want to specify. And they build up some points, and then at some point, when they reach a threshold, they are entitled to apply for a legal status and pay a fine if you want to punish them for being lawbreakers. Charge them, pay them a $5,000 fine, a $3,000 fine, they'll pay it, and let them get on with their lives. And this line of argument is something that I think you will probably see in an op-ed piece in the New York Times next Sunday edition, this coming Sunday, where I have conspired with Jorge Castañeda, the former foreign minister of Mexico, who was involved in discussions on immigration reform just prior to 9/11, and where we outline these facts and say that this is an opportune time to undertake immigration reform and undertake the final phase of immigration reform. Other things have been accomplished in de facto terms. The only thing we need to do now is to face up to the problems of legalization. I don't think that anything is going to happen before the election, but it is my hope that by laying out these facts and laying out the current situation and pointing out that now is the time, because the pressures for immigration from Mexico are low, illegal migration has stopped. Now is the time to finally bite the bullet and do what we need to do to legalize the people that are here and to prevent the formation of a permanent Latino underclass. So I thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Ron's going to field the questions.
Everybody who wants to speak, please go to the microphone, line up, and then I can do less work and things will be more efficient.
Somebody has to start off, so I'll do that. Your talk was interesting in a lot of respects, but I sort of got intrigued in your feedback model of apprehensions, conservative legislation. And it's positive feedback, so it leads to an upward spiral.
Yep.
In most cases with positive feedback, if there's a negative shock, it can lead to a downward spiral. And you've indicated that illegal immigrants has declined to zero, so there can't be apprehensions. And so I'm wondering if that could then lead to a downward spiral.
That's my hope. And I think, personally, I think the boom in Mexican immigration is over for a variety of reasons. The conditions that were driving it on both sides of the border have largely been mitigated. South of the border, illegal migration was substantially driven by rapid demographic growth, rapid expansion of the labor force, and not enough jobs. But the Mexican fertility rate has fallen from about 5.5 children per woman in the 1970s to 2.3, 2.4 children today. We're at 2.2, 2.3 children per woman. So, and Mexico's turned a corner. It's becoming an aging society. Labor force growth is decelerating. Second, structural changes have occurred since the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement. A middle class has expanded in Mexico. Conditions aren't that bad in Mexico. They have serious problems with inequality, but they're not going to solve those problems of inequality by migrating to the United States, because our Gini index is almost the same level as Mexico's Gini index. And a lot of the non-wage problems, the market failures that were driving immigration from Mexico in earlier years, have been solved. There's much more access to credit markets, capital markets, and other sources of finance in Mexico than there was before. On the U.S. side, of course, demand has stagnated in the United States, labor demand. And particularly, it's collapsed in what had been a big driver during the 90s and 2000s of Mexican immigration, that's residential home construction. And with all the vacant houses on the market, that's not going to be coming back anytime soon. The key demands are in food processing and agriculture, and increasingly that's being met by legal circulating workers. And increasingly the migration of Mexicans on temporary work visas is not unskilled, but more skilled. In 2010, there were 100,000 entries by TN visas. Those are temporary NAFTA visas, NAFTA professional visas. And there were about 100,000 entries of treaty trader and investor visas. So increasingly, the realities of North American economic integration that we ourselves have set in motion are returning Mexico-US migration system to circularity, but under legal rather than undocumented auspices. And in fact, apprehensions are plummeting. And you've got 22,000 Border Patrol officers with a $6 billion budget with increasingly nothing to do. And so they're inventing work. Now they're asserting their right to stop and inquire about the legal status of anybody with 100 miles of any American border. 2/3 of the American population lives within 100 miles of a border. And they can stop and search and inquire any of us at any time. They're asserting this right. So I think we are in a situation where this whole process is decelerating. We've got all these people looking for immigrants, but they're not finding them. And even though the number of Border Patrol officers and border resources keeps growing, the number of apprehensions is falling. What's increasing, at least it has increased and perhaps has reached a plateau, is deportations. And that's a permanent bureaucracy that will continue to do that until we do something to either we get rid of the illegal migrants by legalizing them, in my view, would be the logical thing to do, or dismantling that bureaucracy. But as long as we have a large population of undocumented migrants here, and we have a bureaucracy that's dedicated to deporting them, they're going to do their work. And that creates huge human tragedies, family separations, children terrorized. They break into people's houses at 2 in the morning, and it's really, if you see it in person, it's really pretty awful. And so the border logic, the border dynamic is winding down. It remains to be seen what happens with the internal dynamic. I've been personally very disappointed in the Obama administration because he's accelerated border enforcement and accelerated deportations, even though he knows damn well that illegal migration has been at a net of 0 since 2008. What he should have done was, when he comes into office in 2008, in 2009, he holds a press conference and says, for the first time in 60 years, we've gained control of the border. My administration has stopped illegal migration. It's time to move on to the other pillars of immigration reform. But did he do that? No. He accelerated border enforcement. He accelerated deportations in the lame belief that somehow if he got more tough, the other side, the opponents would give in. But the opponents have sworn a blood oath not to vote for anything that Obama wants to do. So it's a fool's errand. It's really been disappointing.
You mentioned Canada, and I wanted to refer to it in a different context. For the last 2 weeks or so, Canada's national newspapers have been talking about ways to increase immigration, things that the government can do. And I wonder if you could speculate about why in the contemporary period the dialogue is so different from the two nations, given the proximity and some similar orientations on many things.
That's a very good question. And I think it's the legacy of race in the United States and the paranoid style in American politics. Race casts a long shadow in the United States. And over the past 2 decades, we've seen a very deliberate process of racialization directed at Latinos, who have been increasingly portrayed, building on the trope of illegality, portrayed as threatening others, racialized, threatening others. And it's become quite rooted in the United States, and it frankly really troubles me. Canada, in fact, is a much more of an immigrant receiving country than the United States, as you obviously know. You're Canadian. Their foreign-born percentage is twice ours. And the average American, when they think of a Canadian, they think of the Mountie from Monty Python or something, and they look like us, right? But if you go to Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal, I mean, you look around and they're more multiracial than we are. And yet they're able to do it in a way that's relatively seamless. They have a very different ideology. They have a much greater tolerance for racial and ethnic diversity, not without problems entirely, but it seems to work better. I think that's because the government actually takes a more realistic view of immigration and recognizes that they're going to get immigrants and makes a provision for it. So they actually attempt to attract skilled migrants. And for seasonal agricultural work, they've now set up their version of a Bracero program, which is bringing in increasingly large numbers of Mexican migrants for seasonal labor in Canada. So I think the Canadians are just more realistic about their place in a global economy, and that in a global economy you're going to have people moving in and out, and if you want to be a prosperous nation, a peaceful nation in a global trading system, you have to make provisions for that. The United States thinks it's all powerful and can just say, okay, we've decided no immigrants, and the economic logics are completely at odds with this fact. And the result is illegal migration, and then that sets off this whole chain that I just described.
I see that we have people lined up, and that's just about perfect for our timing here, so we're going to take it away.
Hi, David.
Thank you, Doug. I have a question. I'm going to resist the kind of specific migration question, though this is what I do. And I'm very preoccupied with what we might call kind of the new mobile underclass. But yeah, this is a social science audience, and it's a policy series, so let me try to frame it in those terms. You started by saying most of what shapes migration is really political theater, and especially since the 1950s and 60s.
Migration policy. Yeah.
Migration policy has been shaped by these kind of extremely irrational disconnects.
It's shaped by political forces, but the 65 Act was very laudable. It didn't think about what it was doing and the consequences it might have. And if
Right.
the 65 Act had been structured in a different way, none of this would have happened.
Right, and since then, we have
Since then, it's been nasty.
since then, we've had these irrational, the same quote for Botswana,
Well, they're not-
and time and time, but you
I
started
don't
by
like
saying.
I don't like the word irrational, because they're quite rational if you're the head of the INS and you want to get more resources.
True, but in systemic terms, and you talk about in your book, for example, breakdown, that it's kind of, there's the rationality of irrationality and
Yeah.
vice versa, right? So in those terms, you've talked about a number of inconsistencies and illogical outcomes of this. And then at the end, you're saying, we hope to provide these facts. Recently, we're close to some possible comprehensive immigration reform. I just want to ask a general question as social scientists, and that we're constantly trying to provide the facts and then hoping that one day the politicians will kind of see this, aha. How do we get out of this, or what added elements do we have? I mean, you spent at least the last 10 years speaking to Congress, so you're blue in the face, providing extremely clearly written reports and books that lay it all out, and yet we have the rise of these states passing laws in a more decentralized way. I'm sympathetic to the New York Times piece that's coming out, and I'm looking for. There's a kind of general
reason the New York Times to really sway American opinion.
Right. I mean, hope springs eternal, but in terms of public policy, can you speak about the general connection or disconnect between providing facts on the one hand, very clearly, and the outcome in public policy?
It's a difficult environment for someone who lives in the world of facts and logic, because inside the Beltway, there's something in the water. And they live in a parallel universe that is disconnected from the reality that most of us know. And part of the reason is there's special interests out there with a lot of money who are dedicated to pumping misinformation and disinformation into the public sphere. So I'm up against the Center for Immigration Studies, who've got like 9 staff members, and their only goal is to put negative spin on immigration and get something bad about immigration into the news cycle every day. And I got a day job, and but in testimony before Congress, it's me, the guy who's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, has run a research project for 30 years in Mexico, and this hack from the Center for Immigration Studies, whose ass is fired tomorrow if he decides immigration is good for the United States. And he's given the same legitimacy in the public sphere as me. And it's not personal sour grapes, but it's just frustrating. So there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation being pumped in for deliberate political purposes, because a lot of wealthy people would rather have working class America exercised about illegal brown migrants from south of the border than the financial shenanigans that's transferring wealth out of the real economy into the pockets of a small number of people in New York City, in my opinion. The other thing is that we lack a political champion. You need a politician of national stature that's willing to get up and take this issue on and call the anti-immigrant clack for what it is. And just say, this is totally un-American, it's no basis in fact, it's counterproductive, here's the reasons why, and this is where they can use me as facts and logic, but make the case on principles backed up with facts and logic. The biggest champion of immigration reform in the modern period was Edward Kennedy. And if Ted Kennedy hadn't gotten sick and died, I think we would have had immigration reform by now. I think we've also passed a very different health care bill and had it implemented much earlier. But it's fate, bad luck. Kennedy got sick. And they lacked the 60-person majority, filibuster-proof Senate. He alone was able to pull people from across the aisle and bridge the gap with who he was, the magnetism of his personality and his political skills. It was just bad luck. And nobody stepped into the fray. There's nobody national political stature that is willing to defend immigrants. The Republican Party, you may have noticed in the debates, they fall all over each other to talk about how bad they can be for immigrants. I'll be bad for immigrants. No, I'll be worse for immigrants. No, I'm going to be even harsher than him. And the Democrats, silent. I thought Obama was going to be that champion, and during the 2008 campaign, he led us to believe he would be that champion. But in office, he has proved a disappointment. He's accelerated deportations, accelerated border enforcement, and has done nothing to live up to his promises of immigration reform that he made to Latinos, who gave him 2/3 of their votes in the 2008 elections. And he's alienated his base, and he's in political jeopardy because of that right now. I don't even understand the political calculation. You're trying to assuage people who will never vote for you, and meanwhile you're alienating one of your key pillars of your own support. Makes no political sense to me at all.
Last question.
All right, hi. So a lot of the general popular discourse within the U.S. on undocumented immigration is focused on Latin America. And current proposals for reform, like the DREAM Act, a lot of people don't know that about 40% of the students who would be affected by the federal DREAM Act are Asian students. So I guess I was just wondering if you can comment on why the discourse in the U.S. is so focused on Latin America and its impact on other immigrant communities as well.
Well, the DREAM Act affects a very specific subset of the undocumented population in which Asians are overrepresented. If you look at the entire undocumented population, 60% are Mexican, 25% are from Latin America. So 85% are Latin American. It's a problem of this hemisphere. It's not a global problem. Among all undocumented migrants in the United States today, under 2% are from China, under 1% are from India. Now, those that are here are a very selected subset of those origin populations, and they come with a high level of human capital, a high level of skills and education, and so a lot of them are the people in colleges and universities who would benefit from the DREAM Act. But the DREAM Act would only apply to people who complete college or go to college and people who want to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. And that's a tiny subset of the undocumented population. And so the attention is focused on Latin Americans is because they're the overwhelming majority of the undocumented population.
I just thought that was one of the most interesting talks that I've ever seen. I have to say, very timely, because you see, I'm in Arizona. I know this is kind of frightening, and soon I'll have to visit once again with my brother-in-law, who lives in Phoenix. He's a professional golfer. He didn't give any money to Obama. Can I have your slideshow? Thank you.